I'm reading, one of Pittsburgh's hidden treasures, a still fully functioning scientific operation that dates to the late 19th century. So if you're interested, we're going to put a sign-up sheet outside, put your name, contact information, and we'll reach out to you. That's really interesting event next week. Since it's vacation, you might be able to go with the kids, partners, and whatever. All right. Now the center on Friday, we have a talk. It's online. It's part of the Future Former Fellow series. The talk will be given by Sam Schindler from Denmark, and it's going to be about on the limits of AI-driven discovery in science. You're all invited to that talk, of course. You can find the link online on the center's website. Next week, at last, we've got a week of without teaching, without center activity. It's a break. I'm sure you're all as excited as I am by the idea of a break. So there's nothing at the center next week. We're coming back for just 1 week of talk at the center, and we're going to have a talk by Lucy Mason, who's a philosopher of physics, doing a postdoctoral fellowship with David Wallace in the HBS, and then Armin Schulz, a former set of fellows, philosopher of economics, philosopher of biology, will be giving the last talk of the semester on Friday, December 5th, here at the center. I think Armin will be coming on Thursday afternoon, so if you're interested to talk to him, I can give you his email and you can just reach out. I'm pretty sure I'd be delighted to chat with you. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Kate Finley, who is associate professor at Hope College. She's also a visiting fellow at the Center for Philosophy of Science this semester, so we'll have the pleasure to spend time with her. I met Kate a year ago because we're part of a Templeton-funded grant on experimental philosophy of religion. So we were at a conference together. I had an occasion to meet her, so it was really a wonderful conference, wonderful opportunity as well. Kate works in the philosophy of cognitive science and in bioethics. She works on issues such as mental disorder, addiction, and suffering. She has published widely on this topic, and we just mentioned a few recent articles, one in Ergo, Embodied Cognition and the Gap and the Grip of Computational Metaphors. One is the American Journal of Bioethics, the leading journal in bioethics. And also an article in Philosophy, Psychiatry, and Psychology, the leading journal in the philosophy of psychiatry, models of psychopathology and religion. And today, Kate will be looking about mechanism and machine metaphors in psychiatry, since the role of metaphors in cognitive science and psychiatry is one of her research interests. So, looking forward.
All right, cool. Okay, I don't need to do anything more with, oh, Sam's, okay, I'm sure it's working. Okay, cool. All right.
Try to move the slides forward.
Yes.
That's what I wanted. Oh, it's working.
Woohoo!
It's the first time of the semester.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming, especially because of the lecture yesterday. Yeah, I am nervous and under the weather, but you know, this will be fun. This is very much a project or a paper that I've completely rethought and reworked just in my time here at the center. So this is very much currently baking set of ideas that I'm really curious to get y'all's thoughts on. And yeah, some of this stuff I'm going to be going very quickly through just to kind of fit it all in, but obviously happy to go back and talk about anything in more detail in the Q&A. Okay, so outline. I'm going to just get some rough definitions on the table, some examples of the kind of phenomena that I'm talking about. Then I'm going to say a little bit more about mechanisms in psychiatry and how I think their usage is kind of playing into what I think ultimately is this reductionistic use and interpretation of biogenetic explanations of mental disorder that can in part be explained by or better understood by appealing to the influence of mechanistic metaphors, machine metaphors. And I'm going to talk about how I think in various ways kind of the usage of mechanisms in work in psychiatry leads to this kind of explanatory vacuum into which these metaphors are kind of like sucked in and play this role. And then I'm going to say a little bit more about non-mechanistic modeling in psychiatry and some recent work on decision-making in psychiatry that I think kind of speaks to a potential way forward in light of some of these criticisms. Okay, so, whoops, there we go. Okay, so just very rough and ready definitions, especially for what I'm going to be talking about. By mental disorder, psychiatric disorder, I have in mind what you think. So things like major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, schizophrenia. Here's a pretty standard definition. And then what I'm going to be focusing on is basically the influence and role played by biogenetic explanations for psychiatric disorder and understood in a particular way. So these two kind of sets of explanations that are often contrasted against each other are very much the kind of explanations that are at issue in lay people and psychiatrists, obviously not reflective of the more nuanced kind of explanations for psychiatric disorder that we often work with in philosophy. And that's by design, because a lot of what I'm looking at kind of, is ultimately like the influence and stickiness and effects of these biogenetic explanations. So what we have in mind when biogenetic explanations are referred to, especially in empirical literature that look at correlates and effects of adoption of biogenetic explanations, is something pretty minimal, that psychiatric disorder results solely or ultimately from biological dysfunctions in the individual. This specific way of understanding the claim that psychiatric disorders are brain disorders that goes beyond naturalism or like this general metaphysical sense, right? So when we're talking about biogenetic explanations and their impact, it's not this like broad view according to which, of course, mental disorders are brain disorders in some sense due to just like metaphysical commitments to physicalism. Instead, we have something more like this narrow view in mind where, there's this specific way in which people are thinking the ultimate explanation for psychiatric disorder is somehow grounded in appeal to these underlying biological dysfunctions. And the contrast often pitched, again, is this like very kind of broad biopsychosocial notion of explanation, where instead, psychiatric disorder is seen as resulting from interactions between biological, psychological, social dysfunctions. Okay, so I'm going to just go real quickly through some evidence, I think, of the effects of the kind of phenomena that I'm going to be talking about. So first, when we look at a lot of research on lay people, I think you have these really fascinating effects. So one, you see, unsurprisingly, probably an increased adoption of these like reductive, kind of simplistic biogenetic explanations for mental disorder in lay populations. And then two, there's a wealth of research looking at how increased adoption of these biogenetic explanations are correlated with, and in some experimental studies seem to cause, a range of kind of unanticipated negative side effects and a couple positive ones. So some of the big ones are, you see that in people who themselves do not experience mental disorder, increased adoption or endorsement of these biogenetic explanations is associated with increased stigma in various respects. So an increased perceived dangerousness of people who have mental disorder, an increased desire for social distance, an intuition that they are somehow categorically abnormal. Also in patients or people who themselves experience mental disorder, an increased adoption or endorsement of these biogenetic explanations is associated with increased prognostic pessimism, decreased sense of self-efficacy. In my own work, I've seen it associated with a decreased propensity towards meaning-making surrounding experiences of mental disorder, which is really important because of the role that meaning-making plays in our ability to deal with suffering, a devaluing of non-biological treatments and overvaluing or increased hope placed in biological treatments, and then a couple positive effects, so a decreased sense of self-blame and an increased perceived legitimacy. And then lastly, just some really fascinating work from this sociologist, Joseph Davis, recently, who published this book after doing extensive interviews with lots of young people, especially in the United States, asking them in various ways about how they were conceptualizing their everyday experiences and suffering. And one of his big ideas was noting that there's been this big shift and embrace of what he called the neurobiological imaginary. So this shift from an initial or default explanation of suffering in vernacular terms of mental life to an account in terms of malfunctioning brain states that mechanistically disturb thought, emotion, or behavior. So this shift from talking about suffering in everyday language to an increased adoption of not only diagnostic labels, but also, again, this kind of naive appeal to, the chemical imbalance theory of depression or things kind of on that level. Okay. And then in psychiatry, we have a couple different things that I'll point to. I'm not going to read all these quotes to you, but right, again, I think we see not the same, but kind of a similar tension and slide towards this naive biological reductionism. So we have former NIMH director Thomas Insull talking about how he spent 13 years at the NIMH really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorder. When I look back on that, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. And then the psychiatrist that I'll kind of talk more about later, who's done this really good work on decision-making in psychiatry. He also speaks to, of course, this like perennial hope in the field of psychiatry that we're going to have this like monocausal kind of discovery of, like underlying mechanisms for mental disorder. Each new candidate is greeted with waves of enthusiasm, followed by gradual disillusionment. Of course, that's not to say there hasn't been a lot of helpful information and applications that have accrued from these areas of study, but you see from the mouths of a lot of psychiatrists articulating this kind of tension between like hope in this happening, gradual disillusionment, and like still this, this sticky appeal, that's a terrible phrase, of this like reductionistic biogenetic explanation of mental disorder being kind of borne out in the research. Okay, and then, a couple more quotes kind of on these lines. So this nice quote kind of articulates this slide a little bit in terms of the two forms of explanation that I mentioned, or the two kinds of explanation. Then president of the American Psychiatric Association said that we must examine the fact that as a profession, we have allowed the biopsychosocial model to become the bio-bio-bio model. The supposed integration of perspectives implied by the term since the 1970s is more illusion than reality. Life events have been relegated to the role of triggers of an underlying genetic time bomb. This is not an integration of models, it's a colonization of the psychological and social by the biological. So again, pointing out this kind of lip service to this more non-reductive, pluralistic biopsychosocial approach, while in practice, this kind of defaulting to this reductive bio-bio-bio approach. Just a few other kind of areas of empirical work that speak to this is there's also been work showing that increased adoption of these biogenetic explanations are associated with decreased empathy on the part of mental health professionals, including psychiatrists, towards their patients. And then also seeming evidence of, again, this kind of disconnect, this explicit endorsement of the non-reductionistic, more pluralistic pictures, but in practice, defaulting to kind of overvaluing, overweighting biogenetic interventions, treatments. Okay. All right. And last thing, I think this also comes up in kind of discussions of the RDoc. I won't go too much into this, but it's just really interesting to look at, right? Not arguing, not saying, one thing or another. There are different, there are lots of different reasons for why people disagree about what the RDoc is, but I think it is interesting to note that even though on the account of many of the originators of it, when you look at the structure of the RDoc, it is very much this intentionally pluralistic approach to try to like ground work relevant to psychiatric disorders in a more empirically grounded way as an alternative to symptoms-based paradigms like the DSM. So this dimensional matrix approach, and many people will say the RDoc guidelines accord no a priori theoretical precedence to any particular units of analysis. All measurement classes are potentially relevant in examining the role and functioning of the constructs, and yet to many people, the RDoc is the exact opposite. It's actually this manifestation and kind of, cause behind this further slide into explanatory reductionism, this kind of crystallization of this naive biological reductionism. So I think that's just another interesting kind of point to note, where again, you see this kind of interpretation of something that's ostensibly pluralistic, not reductionistic in this very like biological reductionistic way. Okay, so some of these things that came up in the examples that I'm interested in, and I think are all sort of downstream effects in some sense of what I'm talking about. Why we might ask why these ostensibly pluralistic frameworks like the RDoC seem to be interpreted by at least a fair number of people within the field in this very reductionistic way. Relatedly, like why are these reductive biogenetic explanations so appealing despite problems? And then why are they associated with some of the effects that I mentioned, right? That don't seem to follow from just biogenetic explanations for mental disorder. If you think the ultimate cause is biological, grounded in your genetics, why does that lead to a decreased sense of self-efficacy or an increased prognostic pessimism or these increases in stigma? Seems to be pointing to some other thing that's sort of playing a role in becoming sort of intertwined with how we're understanding biogenetic explanations. And I think ultimately that thing is kind of the effects of machine metaphors and the sort of thinking and the thinking it tends us towards and the sort of like heuristics it makes more cognitively available. Okay, there are other contributors people have talked about in relation to some of these effects. I don't think they're great. And I think ultimately you can still ask this further question of like, you know, yes, so there might be some of this increased adoption of biogenetic explanations because of some of the positive effects that I mentioned, that it does seem to come with this decreased sense of blame and increased sense of legitimacy. But then the further question to still ask is like, well, what? Like, why does being able to offer a plausible sounding biogenetic explanation for one's mental disorder lead to an increased sense of legitimacy, a decreased sense of blame? Okay, so I think machine metaphors, part of the problem. To talk about that, we're going to talk about how mechanistic explanation and uses of mechanism concepts is pretty ubiquitous in science in general, but especially in the kinds of disciplines that psychiatry draws on, especially in neuroscience. Right, so a quote kind of speaking to this. One of the most frequently used causal concepts is mechanism. This is seen not only in work in these fields, but also in journal submission guidelines, funding guidelines. And the really interesting thing is that it's a ubiquitous term, but it's very often used in like imprecise, ambiguous ways, kind of running the gamut from these very narrow usages to these much more minimal broad usages. So just very briefly, this nice piece by Lauren Ross and Bassett, where they kind of taxonomize the different uses of mechanism and mechanistic explanation in neuroscience research specifically. And I'm kind of taking some of that and adjusting it a little bit to psychiatry. But basically, their broad idea is that you can see usage of mechanism, mechanistic explanation falling into one of these three broad camps. Either it's being used in this very narrow reductive sense, this very broad non-reductive sense, or in a non-causal sense that I'm not going to really talk about. But it is just interesting to note that that also represents like usage of the term, kind of demonstrating further the causal elasticity of this mechanism concept. So when we look at narrow reductive usages of mechanism concepts here, right, it's often used to refer to specific types of causal systems with specific traits. It's emphasizing these lower level underlying mechanisms, underlying higher level systems. It often is paired with detailed descriptions of physical interactions. It's also often paired with these reductive explanatory assumptions. And here, this would be the kinds of mechanisms appealed to in some instances of biogenetic explanation, so including things on that level. Then when we look at the broad non-reductive sense of mechanism as they're talking about it, it includes usage of the term in the narrow sense, as well as a much wider range of usage. So they talk about mechanism concepts being used in this sense to refer to a wide class of causal systems with different features, sometimes simply being used synonymously with causal system. It does not require lower scale or physical detail. It's not paired with reductive assumptions. And so these would be things where mechanisms are being appealed to not only on like the biological level, but also the psychological level, and also just then in this very general kind of causal sense. Okay, so you might have thought these narrow, reductive senses of mechanism seem to align very well with what we might think of as the machine metaphor sense of mechanisms. As they note, these mechanisms are sometimes analogized to machines and bear similarity to the original use developed by 17th century mechanical philosophers, just like kind of rough and ready traits of, machine metaphor influenced conceptions of mechanism are those that are in some sense deterministic, reductionistic, and often limited to or focused on these like underlying physical push-pull dynamics. And then on the broad end, so usage of the term in this sense would include things like so people who are intentionally trying to refer to these like minimal mechanism notions from the new Mechanist. So here, notions of minimal mechanism were developed precisely to basically be like deliberately abstract and permissive and leave behind kind of the machine metaphor baggage of these previous conceptions of mechanism. So here, the idea is mechanism is very minimally conceived as like a mechanism for a phenomenon consists of entities or parts whose activities and interactions are organized so as to be responsible for the phenomenon. It's intentionally not necessarily deterministic, reductionistic, or limited to those underlying kind of push-pull dynamics. Okay, so there's obviously a lot more to say about that, but I think ultimately what arises when you look at the spectrum of mechanism usage, so usage of mechanism concepts and mechanistic explanation, ranging from the very narrow, reductive sense that's really closely aligned with these machine metaphors to this more broad, minimal usage. I think, of course, on this narrow end, it's often intentionally being used in a way that's like aligned with these machine mechanism tendencies towards thinking of things in reductionistic and deterministic ways. But I think even when you're using it in this like intentionally either broad or very minimal sense, what can happen, especially in psychiatry, is that basically invoking mechanism in that intentionally very thin way essentially creates certain kinds of explanatory vacuums into which these machine metaphor heuristics, metaphysical assumptions kind of are sucked back in, right? And so, yeah. So just to kind of say a little bit more about why you think that might be, especially in psychiatry, is because, right, minimal mechanism notions, again, intentionally tells us very minimal things about the underlying causal system that it's talking about. So like tells us that some entities and activities are causally relevant, they're organized in some way, and together are responsible for a phenomenon, but intentionally doesn't tell us which levels of entities and activities matter most, what kind of organization is relevant, how should various components be causally weighted. And in psychiatry, especially, and when we're talking about clinical practice, those are some of the very things that are sort of live issues. And when you're using these very minimal notions that don't really give clarity in how you might answer these sorts of questions, I think that's where we often get this defaulting to reductionistic interpretations, thinking of mechanisms as deterministic in various ways, and other sorts of effects. Okay, so yeah. Kendler's mechanistic property cluster model of psychiatric disorders. Just kind of to say a little bit about this, right? So this is, from Kendler, Zakar, and Craver. So basically, this is just one instance of the minimal mechanism notion used in an account of psychiatric disorders. And the details don't matter as much, at least at this point. I'm happy to talk about this more, but basically with this mechanistic property cluster model, right, it's modeled on this, okay, so basically the idea is like you have this multidimensional matrix of mental states, brain states, and then psychiatric disorders are those that are kind of, they're like these clusters of mechanisms at multiple levels. And so the idea is that this theory is trying to explain or talk about psychiatric disorders and their classification in a way that is realist but non-essentialist. So they're defined not in terms of essences, but in terms of complex, mutually reinforcing networks of causal mechanisms. And so there are these like fuzzy boundaries defined by mechanisms at multiple levels that act and interact to produce the key features of this kind. So, right, again, insofar as it's really embracing this like minimal mechanism notion, it's not providing, any information about how we should privilege a specific level at which the relevant mechanisms are to be found. It's intentionally not kind of trying to give us advice about how to kind of split and lump these diagnostic categories. And the authors acknowledge this, right? So they acknowledge that in a lot of respects, they're kind of taking out, they mentioned like a promissory note, basically acknowledging that like our current knowledge of the mechanisms underlying various psychiatric disorders are pretty thin, like our knowledge of that is pretty thin, but essentially they're like taking out this promissory note by talking about mechanisms as providing this like structure for how we ought to understand mental disorder. So this is not to say that theories like theirs are in any way deficient because they're not able to perform this function in sort of guiding clinical practice in psychiatry. But the point is instead, by the admission of many psychiatrists, something like Kendler et al.'s mechanistic property cluster approach is kind of the most sophisticated, like that's what they have access to. They often will talk about like the biopsychosocial model as, something that's providing this like background theoretical framework for their diagnostic practice. And so even with this more sophisticated version, I think we do have these like explanatory vacuums or gaps that emerge, again, just because those are the resources available to be used to sort of guide diagnostic practice in terms of how we're thinking about what a mental disorder is. So, right, just again to say, I think that like this explanatory gap is like especially exacerbated or widened because of specific features of psychiatry as a discipline and psychiatric practice. So again, like these knowledge gaps, lack of well-established mechanisms for most disorders. There are these interesting integration challenges that Marchioni points out. So basically talking about Kendler's MPC view specifically, but just the rough version is that because different disciplines that those models will inevitably draw from have different modeling practices, they taxonomize differently, there's often no clear guidance for integration of models from those different disciplines into this overall mechanistic picture. And so this often leads to this trade-off between completeness and tractability. And then I think in clinical practice, there are also these added features where, a diagnostician must act with incomplete knowledge. Again, these questions of like which levels of entities and activities matter most, how should we weight these various components? Also, diagnosis serves multiple functions, right? So I think especially in psychiatry, the explanatory piece is very important, as well as this semiotic piece. So like providing an explanation that both facilitates like intervention and treatment, but also can provide, intentionally or not, this like meaning-making structure for patients to try to make sense of their experience and aid in their self-understanding. And then there are other, elements of psychiatry that I've mentioned previously, just in terms of how it conceptualizes itself in relation to other branches of medicine, that again, I think all of these kind of concerns and issues can contribute to this both widened explanatory vacuum as well as like kind of, competing influences. Again, I think a lot of this pushes towards this like reductionistic, deterministic way of interpreting mechanisms in psychiatry. Okay, so a little bit more specifically now about metaphors. So conceptual metaphor theory, which I'm just kind of taking for granted, is the idea that metaphors are not merely linguistic, but conceptual devices, right? So the idea is that like our usage of metaphors in our language is just kind of, this isn't exactly a tip of the iceberg, but just the tip of the iceberg. And then it's indicating, but not exhausting, like the underlying conceptual devices that are shaping our thoughts. And so I think like machines, how we understand machines and their mechanisms are what's playing the role of what are known as like source domains, right? So the idea is with metaphors, when they're playing this like conceptual framework role, we have a target domain and concepts in the target domain, which are typically more abstract, complex, less familiar. Those are the things we're trying to understand. So in this case, mental disorders, certain processes, you know, giving rise to mental disorders. And then what's happening with metaphors is we're like unconsciously associating and in some cases mapping our understanding of that phenomena onto our understanding of the underlying source domain, which is typically more concrete, tangible, more familiar. So in this case, it would be, machines, their mechanisms, in our physical experience with them, our understanding of them, how we explain them, how we fix them. And here, I don't think there's too much to say about, right? So analogies and metaphors are different. Analogies take the form, you know, S is like T, metaphors S is T. I think ultimately because of something like the career of metaphor theory, which is that when you have novel, less familiar metaphors, they're processed more as associations, so like analogies. So the brain is like a machine, but then when they get to the point of being conventional metaphors that are very deeply entrenched, ubiquitous, which is the case for these machine metaphors, they're often processed more as categorizations, right? So they're more processed in some sense as like we're thinking of the brain or various neural processes like as mechanisms in a machine. I think when we're talking about mechanisms in psychiatry, there are two target domains to keep in mind. So both like the reference of mechanisms and mechanistic explanations. And so mechanisms are being mapped onto, or our understanding of the reference of mechanisms are being mapped onto our understanding of mechanisms in machines. And then our understanding of mechanistic explanations is being mapped onto our understanding of explanations for mechanisms in a machine. Okay, so there's a lot of empirical work on metaphors. Happy to say more about some of this in the Q&A. But here are some of the effects that we can see in empirical work looking at the role of metaphors in shaping our thoughts and theorizing about various domains. I'm kind of shocked the extent to which like machine metaphors, computational metaphors are very underexplored themselves, and that's kind of informing some of the empirical research that I'm doing. But so for now, we mostly have empirical research that I think can kind of speak into this, but doesn't directly map onto this. So here are some of the effects, and then I'll just say a little bit about this example to maybe make it a little bit more concrete. But so research on the impact of metaphors seems to indicate that like in some cases, what we see in terms of their effects are the target concepts are inheriting traits from source concepts. There's this impact on the cognitive availability of related metaphors and metaphorical statements. There's often a lack of awareness or misattribution of the effects of metaphors. There can also be this imaginative resistance towards metaphors and non-metaphorical statements that don't fit with the metaphorical framework at issue. Another interesting thing is it does seem to inform thinking across education stages and is not necessarily associated with just like early on learners or naive understandings of concepts. There's been really fascinating research looking at learning and theorizing, especially in like physics and math, showing how you do see even at the levels of experts, this like in some instances, actually more of an emphasis on and kind of use of metaphorical framings to make sense of the phenomena, especially as you get into more kind of complex and abstract domains. And there's also interesting work looking into, again, not machine metaphors in particular, but for example, like war metaphors in cancer treatment. And it looks like these metaphors can like shape treatment decisions there. Okay, so just very briefly, this example to kind of get at concrete versions of some of these effects. Interesting studies by Theobato and Boroditsky, where basically they had two sets of participants. They gave one group, so they gave both of them vignettes about crime in a fictional city, as well as a shared set of statistics about that crime. And in one group, the vignettes that described the crime, did so using like virus metaphors for crime, infecting the city, right? And in the other group, it was framed in terms of like these beast kind of individual aggressor metaphors. And some interesting things that they found were that it did look like the groups people were in and the vignettes that they were exposed to correlated with, at the very least, their decisions about what they thought should be done to kind of affect crime in the city, what they thought the underlying causes of crime in the city were. So you can kind of see, right? So people in the virus group were more likely to basically see crime in this systematic way that's very much in keeping with how we understand viruses, how they affect things, how we treat them, versus people in the beast vignette condition were much more focused on like the individuals behind the crime. We need harsher sentences. We need to fund the police to kind of combat crime. And in addition to that, I just found it really fascinating that like they also asked participants, like, okay, so why did you make the decisions that you made on what should be done about crime in this fictional city? Most people said the statistics, which they were given and were shared. And then they said, okay, well, were there any metaphors in the vignette you were given? Most people said no. And then when they said, well, there were, what were the metaphors? Most people didn't know. And so that's one kind of demonstration of this way in which metaphors can sometimes shape thinking in a way that's pretty invisible. We're not aware of the shaping role that it's playing. And in the absence of understanding their influence, we kind of default to what we think should rationally inform our decisions. In that case, it would be statistics about crime in this fictional city. But those statistics were clearly being filtered through these different metaphorical frameworks that people were being given. Okay, so, right, machine metaphors in particular, like I mentioned, I think some of these effects are potentially even stronger because they are these dominant, conventional, ubiquitous metaphors that to many people do not seem like they're metaphors. They've become very much a part of the literal language for how we describe different processes at biological, psychological levels. Plays this foundational role, very explanatorily powerful. And yeah, again, I think these effects can be seen at the level of how we're understanding mechanisms in psychiatric disorder, as well as mechanistic explanations of psychiatric disorder. Okay, so, yeah, basically just to say a little bit more about this. So I think ultimately these are, where the effects are manifesting. Again, I think that, right, the idea is that even in instances where people are intending to use mechanism concepts, mechanistic explanations in this very minimal, literal way, this can sometimes, because of these explanatory vacuums when they're being used in psychiatric practice, kind of open the door back up to these tendencies or metaphysical assumptions or kind of heuristics that are coming from this way in which we think about and understand machines, and how we understand machines by reducing them down to their component parts, and how we fix machines by like diagnosing the broken part or replacing it, right? And how machines are deterministic in this way. I think that a lot of those things are just kind of being read back into how mechanism concepts are being used and understood. And again, in a way that kind of is explained in different ways, but takes place at points along the spectrum, ranging from the very narrow, intentionally kind of metaphor embracing usage to the very minimal, intentionally broad usage. Okay. And then, just a little bit about, right, you might think like, what would non-mechanistic modeling in psychiatry look like? Great recent book this year, How Psychiatrists Make Decisions, from Douglas Heinrichs. And one of the big things he talks about is, so one, he talks about the paradigmatic activity of the psychiatrist is to generate a model of the individual patient in order to develop a specific understanding of that patient's circumstances and potential avenues for intervention. In the process of generating a model, however, the psychiatrist draws on a range of information from other disciplines that are highly informing for the practice of psychiatry. And basically some of the big things are that, so he's really emphasizing the role of like constructing this individual model of a patient as something that in some sense happens to a unique extent in psychiatry in particular, like needs to happen in psychiatry in particular, and basically providing a model which goes beyond, but can sometimes include like a diagnosis. And I'll show you an example of kind of how he maps this out in a minute. And then another thing that he very intentionally does is basically talks about and constructs these models, and in conversations with his patients, talks about it not in terms of mechanisms, but in terms of patterns of propensities, which he does specifically because of this deterministic baggage of mechanism concepts in psychiatry. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so I know this is a lot of lines, but basically the way he goes about this, which I think is just interesting at least to think of in terms of as like, yeah, contrast to some of these tendencies in more mechanistic approaches to diagnosis and modeling in psychiatry, is he talks about this patient. Basically the patient, I'll just read a little bit about, the patient. Okay, so Mr. Z entered treatment with me at age 40, so shortly after discharge from the hospital. A bright man diagnosed as suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. He was able to hold a highly responsible technical job, despite being very socially isolated. When not at work, he spent his time decoding comic strips for communications from aliens threatening to destroy the Earth, hoping to learn how to stop them. Usually, he was able to approach this task with detached intellectual curiosity. Periodically, however, he became overwhelmed at the potential threat from the aliens. He then began preaching on the streets and telling people to seek shelter, or he was taken to the emergency room in a frantic, agitated state. Several weeks of hospitalization and treatment with an antipsychotic restored his calm state and allowed him to reestablish his detached interest in his delusions. However, shortly thereafter, he would invariably stop medication because he began to feel too mentally dulled and flat and increasingly detached from his delusional thoughts. The pattern would inevitably repeat in 6 to 12 months, culminating in another hospitalization. Mr. D had worked with several outpatient psychiatrists, but always terminated treatment when they argued that his beliefs about aliens were untrue and insisted that he continue maintenance antipsychotic medication. Initially, he wanted no medication since the aliens were real in his mind, and his medication never took his belief in them away, but it did disrupt their communications with him, with fewer messages from them for him to decode. He went on to explain that he had no real life outside of his work, but his interactions with the aliens and his mission to decode their messages provided him with a sense of purpose as well as intellectual stimulation. When medication made it impossible for him to engage in this activity, his life seemed empty and boring, almost done. He wanted a psychiatrist who would be willing to treat him without medication. He also wanted a person he could talk to about the aliens, which he both found stimulating and comforting. He realized that to do so with coworkers or strangers would be perceived as crazy. Nonetheless, he felt a great pressure to be able to discuss these issues with someone he assumed the psychiatrist would see the aliens as symptoms of mental illness, and perhaps until perhaps persuaded otherwise, but would have to listen anyway, since after all, I'm paying them to listen. Okay, I know that's an interesting case for sure. Part of why Heinrichs talks about this is because in various ways, the way in which he had to construct and revise his individual model of this patient really, showed the importance of that individual modeling task going beyond kind of what might be prescribed in terms of like how to apply evidence medicine-based standards, paying more attention to the patient's goals, and ultimately thinking about the model of the patient in this much more like less mechanistic in the sense of deterministic way of thinking about these things. So he talks about these as patterns of propensities as opposed to mechanisms. Also, you can see clearly it's like embracing kind of causation between different levels. And also, too, you can see the way in which, like, from his initial model to his revised model, essentially there's kind of this increasing recognition of the potential drag that was put on the initial model by thinking about this patient maybe too much in terms of like the diagnostic classification into which he was put and what kind of the prescribed steps would be for, you know, how to treat his delusions, and instead embrace things more based on the patient's individual goals. Okay, so I think ultimately, yeah, that's just one example where we can kind of see, yeah, this like non-mechanistic modeling approach, and we can see in various ways how it, yeah, is like non-deterministic, non-reductionistic. One thing to notice about pop models like this, patterns of propensity models, is like once you build many more kind of causal nodes into it, it starts to very much resemble this like more networked approach. It also seems to like lessen the extent to which any individual node can be given kind of undue causal weight or be seen in this more reductionistic way. And it is something that ultimately leaves more room for the agent of the patient. It's like being built into the model and has conceptual space in a way that kind of more reductionistic mechanistic approaches don't. So I think that mechanism in psychiatric practice, looking at this impact on clinicians, patients, kind of the general public, we should be much more careful and hesitant and reticent to use mechanism notions, mechanistic explanations, especially in these venues. Of course, that's easier said than done. And of course, these notions are very valuable in research, in neuroscience, in psychology especially. But I think it's important to note the way in which, again, precisely at this juncture, and I think other junctures, but this juncture where the psychiatrist and individuals experiencing mental disorder are kind of going from these broader theories or models to this more on-the-ground diagnosis, attempts to understand, meaning making. That's where this, yeah, explanatory gap vacuum can kind of let back in some of these harmful tendencies towards determinism, reductionism that can lead to or be associated with some of the effects I mentioned initially, such as like increased prognostic pessimism, decreased sense of self-efficacy, increased stigma, decreased empathy. So yeah, there's a lot more to say about this, but I think a first step towards counteracting some of these influences is just to be more mindful of our usage of these terms. Note that they're not merely functioning as like terms with literal meaning, but can often carry this metaphorical baggage. And some ways to address this include both like greater diversity, intentional diversity of metaphorical frameworks, and also too, like more intentionally embracing kind of the metaphorical frameworks that certain patients bring to their clinicians to describe their experiences with mental disorder. Yeah, it seems like in some instances, this like mechanistic framing, this unintentional mechanistic framing is coming from the psychiatrist to the patients, but often kind of at odds with the metaphors that seem most intuitive to them to make sense of their experience. I think there's also ways to kind of counter some of the specific misunderstandings prompted by this metaphorical baggage. So looking at work that like takes these biogenetic explanations, but pairs them with explicit like information about biological malleability, neuroplasticity. It can kind of counteract some of the effects, like the self-efficacy effects, prognostic pessimism, that seem to rely on this much more deterministic understanding. Also too, like emphasizing patients' narratives in various ways. And lastly, yeah, kind of at a further level up, like recognizing the cultural specificity of many of these metaphors and metaphorical frameworks. There's really fascinating like cross-cultural psychiatric research looking at really different experiences of people, say, with auditory hallucinations and schizophrenia, and looking at ways in which, so just, yeah, I'll be done after this, but so basically, some of these studies find this really interesting thing where in India, people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia, those who experience auditory hallucinations, in a lot of instances seem to have a much better prognosis than those in the United States, where by all accounts, the mental health care system is much more built up. This is called like the schizophrenia paradox by the WHO. And interesting anthropological work, basically looking at how patients in these two different countries articulate their experiences of auditory hallucinations and psychosis, seems to point to, at the very least, a correlation between the underlying metaphors and frameworks they have for the mind and their experiences. So in the United States, we have this very, we have this notion of our minds and brains that has very rigid boundaries. It's very private. It's very individual. And of course, even saying that, you're like, yes, what else would it be, right? So it's like my mind or my brain is like my house, where it's like my house and I can lock the doors. And if someone tries to break in, that's super alarming, right? So in India, and they also looked at patients in Ghana, there's much more often this sense of the mind and brain as something that has porous boundaries. So there you might think of it being more like your yard, where it's like yours and it has boundaries. But if someone walks across your yard, it's not as much of a boundary violation. It's not as alarming. And you actually see correlations between those underlying understandings of the mind and brain and kind of how they pervade cultural narratives about mental disorder being correlated with different experiences of auditory hallucinations. So in the United States, patients were much more likely to report auditory hallucinations as we would think of as just like extremely distressing. The voices were telling them to do negative, hateful things. Yeah, much more negative, whereas in both India and Ghana, at least in one of these studies, their experiences were much more mixed. So they were much more likely to say in some instances, no, the voices are telling me neutral things. No, they're actually positive. They help me take care of myself. This is not to say that there's like this really clear kind of single cause behind these differences in experiences, but I think it again just points to the important role and often really under-acknowledged role of these underlying metaphorical frameworks in shaping how we understand the mind, in part because it's really difficult to think outside of the models that we have, right? Like try thinking your way into what would it mean for me to think of my mind or brain as having porous boundaries into which external agents were sometimes just like kind of coming into play. Like what would it be like to live in a culture where that was our understanding of the mind and the brain? It's hard to even conceptualize because of how deep these effects go. Okay, so yeah, there's lots more to say about this, but thank you all for listening. Very curious to hear your thoughts and questions on this project. Okay.
Right, we'll take a 2-minute break and then we'll reconvene for questions.